Imagine you're a German soldier in the final months of World War II. You've spent years believing one thing. If the Americans capture you, you'll be tortured, starved, maybe even executed. That's exactly what Nazi propaganda had drilled into your mind. Now imagine surrendering to American troops, expecting the worst, only to find yourself eating steak, drinking Coca-Cola, and tasting ice cream for the very first time. It sounds impossible. But for thousands of German prisoners of war, it was real. More than 370,000 German POWs were transported across the Atlantic to prison camps throughout the United States during World War II. Instead of the brutal treatment many expected, they encountered something completely different. A country overflowing with food, modern comforts, and a way of life they had never imagined. Today we're uncovering one of World War II's most surprising and least known stories. WWII 1944, Germany's military machine was beginning to collapse. The Allied invasion of Normandy had opened a massive Western front. American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing east. Every week, thousands of exhausted German soldiers found themselves surrounded. Many had little ammunition, little food, and almost no hope. Some units fought to the last man. Others finally surrendered. For many young German soldiers, the moment of capture was terrifying. They had spent years hearing stories that Americans were ruthless enemies. Nazi newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military officers warned them that surrender meant humiliation, or death. So when American soldiers approached, many German prisoners expected beatings. Instead, American troops often handed them cigarettes, sometimes chocolate, sometimes hot coffee. The first shock came immediately. The second was even bigger. The United States faced a unique problem. There were simply too many prisoners. Keeping hundreds of thousands of German POWs in Europe required enormous resources. So Washington made an extraordinary decision. Many prisoners would be transported thousands of miles away, to the United States. Protected by the Atlantic Ocean, America had plenty of space, and thousands of military camps waiting to be converted. For the prisoners, the voyage itself felt unreal. Most had never left Europe. Many had never even seen the ocean before joining the military. Now they were crossing one of the world's largest oceans, not as soldiers, but as prisoners. Ironically, many were safer aboard those ships than they had been on the battlefields of France. Arrival in America. When the trains began carrying German POWs across America, many couldn't believe what they saw. Miles of green farmland, modern highways, endless freight trains, huge factories, cities glowing with electricity. Everything looked different. The prisoners had spent years hearing that Allied bombing had crippled American industry. Instead, factories worked day and night. Store shelves appeared full. Cars filled the roads. Gasoline wasn't a luxury. Electricity wasn't rationed. Food seemed everywhere. To men arriving from war-torn Europe, America looked unbelievably wealthy. Then came dinner. The prisoners expected tiny rations, perhaps watery soup. Instead, they received full military meals. Fresh bread, potatoes, meat, vegetables, coffee, sometimes pie. Many prisoners assumed it was a trick. Surely tomorrow the food would disappear. But tomorrow, the meals were just as generous. Then the next day, and the next. American officials followed the Geneva Convention, which required POWs to receive adequate food and humane treatment. In many camps, German prisoners actually consumed more calories than civilians back home in Germany during the final year of the war. It was almost impossible for them to believe a different enemy. The surprises didn't end with food. Many American guards treated prisoners with professionalism. Medical care was available. Mail could be sent home. Religious services were allowed. Sports competitions were organized. Libraries opened. Some camps even offered educational classes. For soldiers raised under years of Nazi propaganda, none of this matched what they had been told. Slowly, questions began forming in their minds. Had they been lied to? Was America really the brutal enemy they had imagined? Or had the war hidden a very different reality? Those questions would become impossible to ignore. The first time many German prisoners encountered something they'd only heard about in movies, a frozen dessert called ice cream. For young German soldiers who had survived some of the bloodiest battles in history, nothing prepared them for the taste of American ice cream, or the bottle of Coca-Cola that would become one of the most unforgettable memories of their captivity. For many German prisoners, America wasn't just another country. It seemed like another world. Most of these young men had spent years fighting across Europe. They had survived frozen Russian winters, bombed out French villages, and endless days living on canned rations and black bread. Fresh milk was rare. Fresh fruit was a luxury. Sugar had become increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. By 1944, even ordinary German families struggled to find enough food. Many soldiers had forgotten what abundance looked like. Then they arrived in America. Every meal seemed impossible. The portions were large. The bread was fresh. There was real butter, fresh milk, coffee, sometimes even desserts. Many prisoners secretly wondered, how can America feed its enemies this well? The answer lay thousands of miles away. Unlike Europe, the American mainland had escaped wartime destruction. Its farms remained productive. Its railroads worked. Its factories produced food, clothing, and supplies on an unprecedented scale. The United States had become what historians later called the arsenal of democracy. Its factories weren't only producing tanks and airplanes. They were also producing millions of tons of food. Enough to feed American civilians, millions of Allied soldiers, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Then came something many prisoners had never experienced before. Ice cream. Today, that sounds ordinary. But in wartime Europe, frozen desserts were almost non-existent. Sugar was rationed. Milk was limited. Refrigeration was uncommon in many homes. For younger German soldiers, ice cream was something they had only heard about or remembered faintly from childhood before the war. As American cooks handed out bowls, many prisoners simply looked at them. Frozen, sweet, creamy, cold. Some thought it would melt before they could eat it. Others cautiously took a small bite, then another, and another. One former prisoner later recalled that he had never imagined food could taste like that. For a brief moment, the war disappeared. If ice cream was surprising, Coca-Cola was unforgettable. Long before World War II, Coca-Cola had already become one of America's most recognizable products. But inside Germany, very few soldiers had ever tasted it. Some had only seen advertisements years earlier. Others had never heard of it at all. Inside several American POW camps, German prisoners occasionally received Coca-Cola with meals or through camp canteens where permitted. The experience became legendary. The cold glass bottle, the fizz, the sweetness, the refreshing taste. It was unlike anything many had experienced before. For American soldiers, it was just another soft drink. For German prisoners, it became a symbol of America itself. The food wasn't simply about nutrition. It challenged everything many prisoners believed. For years, Nazi propaganda had described America as weak, corrupt, and economically failing. Yet here they were, captured, behind barbed wire, being served meals better than many had eaten during the war. Some prisoners began asking uncomfortable questions. If America was collapsing, why did it have endless supplies of food? Why were its guards healthy? Why were its factories still producing? Why did ordinary civilians appear so prosperous? Every meal quietly weakened years of propaganda. Not through speeches, not through force, but through simple reality. The prisoners were allowed to write home. Although letters were censored, many described life inside American camps. They spoke about good food, medical care, safety, even desserts. Families back in Germany often struggled to believe them. How could prisoners, captured by the enemy, be eating better than civilians living at home? For some, the letters sounded impossible. For others, they became the first hint that the war they had been told about was very different from reality. No one expected ice cream or Coca-Cola to become historical symbols. Yet for thousands of German POWs, those simple American comforts represented something much larger. They revealed the enormous industrial strength of the United States. They challenged years of wartime propaganda. And they showed that even during humanity's darkest conflict, acts of ordinary humanity could leave lifelong memories. But food wasn't the only surprise waiting inside America's prison camps. German prisoners would discover something even more unexpected. They would be allowed to play soccer, read books, attend classes, earn money, and experience freedoms they never imagined possible behind barbed wire. To a German soldier fresh from the battlefields of Europe, the silence was almost unsettling. For years, every morning had begun with the sounds of war. Artillery, machine guns, air raid sirens. Now, the loudest sound was a bugle announcing breakfast. The prisoners were still behind barbed wire, still guarded, still far from home. But compared to the front lines, the camps felt almost peaceful. The United States was bound by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required prisoners of war to receive humane treatment. That meant regular meals, shelter from the weather, medical care, religious freedom, the ability to send and receive mail, protection from violence and unnecessary punishment. American military officials also understood something important. How the United States treated German prisoners could influence how American prisoners were treated overseas. It wasn't only a moral decision, it was a strategic one. While conditions varied from camp to camp, the U.S. generally maintained standards that contrasted sharply with the brutal conditions many POWs faced on the Eastern Front. Each day followed a routine. Wake up, roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work or recreation, dinner, evening free time, lights out. The routine brought something many soldiers hadn't experienced in years. Stability. No fear of sudden bombardment. No desperate retreats. No freezing nights in foxholes. For many, it was the first uninterrupted sleep they'd had in months. As millions of American men served overseas, farms and factories faced serious labor shortages. German prisoners helped fill the gap. Many worked in agriculture, picking cotton, harvesting vegetables, cutting sugarcane, working in orchards. Others repaired roads, processed timber, or worked in food production. The Geneva Convention allowed non-dangerous labor, and prisoners were paid small wages, often in camp-issued credits they could spend at camp canteens. For many American farmers, the arrangement was essential. Without this workforce, crops might have rotted in the fields. At first, there was suspicion. American families had sons fighting in Europe. Many had lost loved ones. Seeing German soldiers working nearby wasn't easy. But over time, something unexpected happened. Conversations began. Farmers discovered that many prisoners had been teachers, mechanics, students, musicians. Before the war, the uniforms no longer told the whole story. Some former prisoners later recalled acts of simple kindness, an extra apple, a glass of lemonade, or a brief conversation about family. These moments didn't erase the horrors of the war, but they reminded both sides of a simple truth. The enemy was also human. Many camps included libraries, German language books, newspapers approved by military censors, language lessons, history classes. Some prisoners learned English. Others studied mathematics, engineering, or literature. American officials hoped education would do more than pass the time. They believed exposure to new ideas could help prisoners think critically about the ideology that had led Germany into war. Not every prisoner accepted those ideas. Some remained fiercely loyal to Hitler until the very end. Others quietly began to question everything they had believed. Sports became one of the camp's most popular activities. Soccer tournaments drew enthusiastic crowds. Some camps even organized leagues between different compounds. Others introduced prisoners to baseball, a sport many had never seen before. There were boxing matches, track events, volleyball games. For a few hours each day, the war faded into the background. Competition replaced conflict. Cheers replaced gunfire. Life wasn't without hardship. Prisoners missed their families. Many had no idea whether their homes still existed. Some learned through letters that parents, wives, or children had died during Allied bombing campaigns. Tensions also existed inside the camps. Hardline Nazi supporters sometimes intimidated fellow prisoners who criticized Hitler. In several camps, violence broke out between prisoners themselves. American authorities eventually separated the most fanatical Nazis from those considered more moderate to reduce internal conflict. So while conditions were generally humane, life behind barbed wire remained emotionally difficult. As months passed, many German prisoners formed a picture of America that no propaganda film had ever shown. A nation with enormous industrial power, abundant food, organized communities, and ordinary people trying to live their lives despite a global war. For some prisoners, this experience planted seeds of doubt that would continue growing long after they returned to Germany. The greatest surprise wasn't the food, or the sports, or even Coca-Cola. It was discovering that the enemy they had been taught to hate was far more complex than they had ever imagined. As the war drew to a close, another transformation began. The United States realized these prisoners would one day return home. The question was no longer how to guard them, but how to prepare them for a Germany without Adolf Hitler. In the next chapter, we'll explore the secret re-education programs that introduced German POWs to democracy, free speech, and a world beyond Nazi propaganda, and why some returned home with completely changed beliefs. By late 1944, American military leaders faced an extraordinary question. Eventually, These prisoners would return to Germany. What kind of Germany would they return to? A nation still loyal to Nazi ideology? Or one ready to rebuild itself? The answer, they believed, started inside the prison camps. The U.S. Army created what became known as the Intellectual Diversion Program. Its goal wasn't to force prisoners to become Americans. Instead, it aimed to expose them to ideas they had rarely encountered under Nazi rule. Books on democracy, philosophy, science, history, economics, religion, music, literature. Discussions were encouraged. Questions were welcomed. For many prisoners, it was the first time they had experienced open debate without fear of punishment. Most German soldiers had grown up in a tightly controlled information system. Newspapers were censored. Radio broadcasts repeated government messages. Schools promoted Nazi ideology. Alternative viewpoints were dangerous. Inside American camps, many prisoners encountered independent newspapers, diverse books, and differing opinions. Some rejected them immediately. Others became curious. One former POW later wrote that the most surprising discovery wasn't America itself. It was realizing how much information had been hidden from him back home. Films became powerful teaching tools. The Army showed documentaries about American democracy, education, industry, and daily life. Some films highlighted how elections worked. Others explained freedom of religion. Others simply showed ordinary American families going about their lives. For prisoners who had expected only brutality, the images were deeply confusing. The America they saw on screen looked nothing like the America described by wartime propaganda. Change did not happen overnight. Many prisoners refused to believe anything presented by the Americans. Some remained fiercely loyal to Hitler, even as Germany collapsed. Inside several camps, committed Nazis attempted to intimidate fellow prisoners who questioned the regime. American officials noticed the growing tensions. To reduce violence, they separated the most hardline Nazi supporters into different compounds. This allowed more moderate prisoners to participate in educational programs without fear of retaliation. The lessons didn't stop in the classroom. Many prisoners worked outside the camps. They saw churches filled on Sundays, local elections, independent newspapers, busy stores stocked with food, people openly criticizing politicians. To men raised in a dictatorship, these ordinary moments often seemed extraordinary. No one appeared afraid to speak. No portraits of political leaders hung in every building. Life looked normal, and that normality left a lasting impression. Then came the announcement. Germany had surrendered. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Inside the camps, the reactions were mixed. Some prisoners wept. Some stood in stunned silence. Others refused to believe it. For years they had been told Germany could never lose. Now, the Third Reich no longer existed. The world they had fought for had vanished almost overnight. Perhaps the most difficult lesson came after Germany's surrender. American authorities began showing prisoners evidence from liberated concentration camps. Many prisoners were shocked. Some denied the footage. Others believed it had been staged. But as more evidence emerged, photographs, witness testimony, news reports, military records, denial became harder to maintain. For many German POWs, this was the moment their understanding of the war changed forever. Not all accepted the truth immediately, but for countless others, it forced them to confront the devastating consequences of the regime they had served. By late 1945, the camps began preparing prisoners for repatriation. Many had spent years in the United States. They had learned English, worked American farms, read American books, played American sports, drunk Coca-Cola, eaten ice cream, made unexpected friendships. Now, they were returning to a homeland they barely recognized. A Germany reduced to rubble, families scattered, cities destroyed, and a future filled with uncertainty. When the trains finally carried German prisoners away from America's camps, many believed they were leaving the best conditions they had experienced since the war began. But returning home would prove far more difficult than captivity itself. Some would spend years rebuilding shattered lives. Others would return to America, not as prisoners, but as immigrants chasing the very dream they first discovered behind barbed wire. For years, these camps had been their entire world. The wooden barracks, the soccer fields, the mess halls, even the watchtowers, places they had once feared, had become strangely familiar. Now the journey home was finally beginning. But almost no one knew what was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. Many German prisoners left the United States with mixed emotions. No one wanted to remain a prisoner forever. Yet many quietly admitted that they were leaving behind safety, reliable meals, medical care, and a country that had treated them with far more humanity than they had expected. Some even exchanged farewell words with American guards. Others carried small souvenirs, a photograph, a dictionary, an English Bible, a notebook filled with new vocabulary. Simple objects that would remind them of an extraordinary chapter in their lives. Nothing prepared them for what they found. Germany, the country they remembered, no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared beneath mountains of rubble. Factories stood silent. Railroads were damaged. Food was scarce. Millions of civilians were homeless. Families had been separated by war. Some prisoners searched for weeks, only to discover their childhood homes had been destroyed. Others found that parents, brothers, or wives had not survived. The contrast with America was impossible to ignore. While Germany struggled to rebuild, many former prisoners remembered the abundance they had witnessed in the United States. The fresh bread, the overflowing farms, the grocery stores, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola. What once seemed ordinary in America now felt almost unbelievable. Some quietly told friends and family about their experiences. Many listeners were skeptical. The Americans treated you well? They gave you enough food? You played sports in a prison camp? The stories sounded too incredible to be true. Yet they were. In the years after the war, an unexpected tradition emerged. Some former prisoners began writing letters to the American families they had met while working on farms. Holiday cards crossed the Atlantic. Photographs were exchanged. In a few remarkable cases, former prisoners returned to visit the very farms where they had once worked under guard. The handshakes that began during wartime became genuine friendships. History had taken two enemies and turned them into lifelong acquaintances. Perhaps the greatest surprise came years later. Some former German POWs made a remarkable decision. They immigrated to the United States, the country that had once imprisoned them. Why? Because during captivity, they had seen opportunity, economic freedom, democracy, jobs, education, the future. Many built successful new lives. Some became engineers, business owners, teachers, mechanics, neighbors, citizens. America had first entered their lives through the gates of a prison camp. Years later, it became their permanent home. Today, historians continue studying America's prisoner of war system. It wasn't perfect. Conditions varied from camp to camp. Some prisoners experienced strict discipline. Others faced tensions with fellow inmates, and life behind barbed wire was never true freedom. But compared with many POW experiences elsewhere during World War II, American camps were generally notable for their adherence to the Geneva Convention and their emphasis on humane treatment. For many German prisoners, the greatest shock wasn't captivity. It was discovering compassion where they expected cruelty. To most Americans, ice cream and Coca-Cola were simply everyday treats. But to thousands of German prisoners, they became symbols. Not because they were luxurious, but because they represented abundance, stability, peace. A nation untouched by the destruction that had consumed Europe. Years later, many former POWs remembered those simple moments more clearly than they remembered military victories or defeats. Because sometimes, history is remembered not through battles, but through ordinary experiences that change the way people see the world. World War II remains one of history's darkest chapters. It brought unimaginable suffering to millions across the globe. No prison camp could erase that tragedy. Yet hidden within this vast conflict are stories that challenge expectations. Stories of humanity surviving amid war. Stories of enemies discovering common ground. Stories of ordinary meals, simple kindness, and unexpected respect. For thousands of German prisoners of war, America was supposed to be the place they feared most. Instead, it became the place that forever changed how they viewed the world. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. Even in the midst of history's most devastating conflicts, compassion can outlast hatred. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more untold stories from World War II, remember to like the video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which forgotten chapter of history we should uncover next. Until next time, thank you for watching.